1 through 27. If you would please turn to that and stand, if you're able, for the reading of God's Word. John 11, 1 through 27. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Now, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world.
I appreciate Andy leading us in prayer and in the scripture reading, of course, and as he was talking about Ellen and Ruth, I got a text message from Ellen yesterday that said, I just want to thank you, Grace Bible Church, for your faithfulness in giving to us. We've had 3 pastors of large churches there in Indonesia who have just this week agreed to take on Alan's ministry of training disciples, evangelism and training disciples. And he said, this is a great joy. And he said, this is fruit from Grace Bible Church sharing with us. So I just wanted to encourage you with that as we give toward missions. God uses it in ways that we just won't be aware of until heaven in many cases. In such a Muslim world as Indonesia, there are great churches preaching the gospel, and we have a direct part in that. So it's a great blessing. Well, as we come to this great story that Andy just read for us or it read the first half for us, actually, in John 11. The raising of Lazarus, or the resurrection of Lazarus. It's important to realize where we are in the big picture of the Gospel of John. We're in chapter 11 today of 21 chapters in this great book. So we're about halfway through. I hope you're not in a hurry, because this book is just so amazing you can't rush through it. It's like going to the Grand Canyon on your way to California, and if you just stop and take a 30-minute view over the edge, you're going to be impressed, but it's not going to be life-changing for you. You need to spend more time seeing the beauty of God's creation. We need to see the beauty of God's Word and the great story that John gives us. And so we're halfway through. But at the same time, I mentioned last week that we are right at the end of what is called Jesus' public ministry. In the next chapter, in chapter 12, we will read of Palm Sunday, which of course is the first day of the last week of Jesus' life. So even though we're only halfway through the book, we are near the end of his earthly life. John spends chapters 13 through 21 on those last days of that last week. Jesus has been doing miracles and signs that point to him as the one sent by God, the Son of Man and the Son of God. God so loved the world that he gave his Son so that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. So John has been telling us this story, and today we see this idea that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, as Andy just read to us. This today is the seventh of the 7 signs that John shows us. We've seen the sign of the changing of the water into wine. We've seen the sign of the healing of the nobleman's son from about 20 miles away. Jesus says he's healed, and even though he's not there in person, he is able to make that happen as a sign toward his power. We've seen the sign of the healing of the lame man by the pool, who had been lame for 38 years. We've seen the sign of the feeding of the 5,000, or more likely 10,000 or 15,000 with women and children. We've seen the sign of Jesus walking on the water. And recently, the sign of Jesus healing the blind man in chapter 9. And today, we see the sign of the resurrection of his friend Lazarus. As we've mentioned several times through these last weeks, Jesus brings division in all of these stories we've been reading. Some believe and their faith becomes stronger and stronger. Some, at the same time, become angry, and their anger and hatred, particularly of the religious leaders in Israel, their hatred for this man continues to ramp up as their hearts grow harder and harder. One of the things that we need to see in the Gospel of John is the reminder that none of our faith remains static, positively or negatively. Faith is like an airplane. You're either going forward or you're going down. If you have faith in Jesus, when you accept him, you continue to grow in that. It is to be an active faith, not a static faith. But on the other hand, as we've seen these last few weeks, if you resist him, you become harder and harder. You don't stay in one place either. That's the reason why the statistics often show us that the great multitude of conversions to Jesus come in childhood or in youth years. And the longer that people go on in their ways, the more hardened they may become. Now, the grace of God can overcome that, and we know many great stories of grace. But that is a picture of how you either are moving toward Jesus or moving away from him. And we really see that in the book of John. You may remember that a couple of weeks ago in chapter 10, as Jesus is at the temple for Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, and he pulls no punches there. He lets it be known in John 10, verse 30, that I and the Father are one. And when he says that, the Jews go ballistic. They once again pick up stones to stone him to death, because this is blatant blasphemy in their eyes. But Jesus is able to escape, not because he's afraid, but because it is not yet his hour. He will lay his life down. No one will take it from him. So we read at the end of chapter 10 that Jesus goes across the Jordan River to the place where John the Baptist had been baptizing at the beginning. So we've come full circle. Jesus comes back to where his ministry began. And it says in chapter 10, verse 41, many came to him there. And then in verse 42, many believed on him there. So once again, there's division. People are believing on him there, and people are making plans to kill him in Jerusalem. He's not hiding there, but he's waiting. His hour has not come yet, but it is getting near. In chapter 11, where we are today, Jesus is called on by dear friends to please come and help. Two sisters named Mary and Martha send word to Jesus that their brother Lazarus is very sick. These three young adults, most likely, brother and two sisters, are very dear to Jesus. They live in Bethany, which is up on the Mount of Olives, about 2 miles from Jerusalem. And it appears that Jesus apparently stayed with them many times as he was traveling back and forth to Jerusalem, because it says that they loved him and he loved them. Jesus is about 20 miles away when he gets the message that Lazarus is sick. Where John was baptizing on the Jordan River is about 20 miles, or a full day's walk from where Lazarus is. So the sisters send word to Jesus, obviously hoping that he can heal Lazarus like they've seen him heal so many others. But Jesus doesn't come. Jesus doesn't show up. And it's not just because it's a 20-mile walk. He just doesn't show. He stays where he is, we're told, for 2 more days. In fact, John's way of writing this story is once again full of irony. We've talked about how John loves irony. And in this story, John tells us in verse 5 that Jesus loved Martha and her sister, Mary and Lazarus, verse 5. So, when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Does that not strike you as odd? Do you remember a few weeks ago when we talked about the Good Shepherd and how the Good Shepherd loves his sheep with an almost ridiculous kind of love? Not because of our nature as stubborn, stupid sheep, but because of his wonderful nature as the Good Shepherd. That's who we're talking about. But when we get to this story, it says Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, so he stayed where he was 2 days. Does that sound like a good shepherd to you? Me neither, at first glance anyway. Isaiah tells us something interesting about God in chapter 55, verses 8 and 9. He says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." When we come to John 11 this morning, we need to keep these two verses in mind from Isaiah. The Lord's thoughts are not our thoughts. His ways are not our ways. We are going to see that over and over again in this resurrection story. In his wonderful little book, Knowing God, J.I. Packer uses an analogy when he's describing the sovereignty of God. The analogy he uses is of a big parade coming down through a town, down through Main Street with floats and bands and children and animals. Most of us, he says, stand on the sidewalk and watch the parade go by. And we see each part of it as it goes by us. But sometimes we may wonder how many more floats or bands are coming. We don't know. They just seem to keep on coming and coming. But if instead of being down on the sidewalk, you went into the tallest building downtown and you took the elevator to the top floor, Packer says you could look out the window and see the whole parade as it snakes through the streets from the beginning to the end. That's what Isaiah is reminding us of. It's a whole different view from up there. When we come to this story of Lazarus, we're going to see that Jesus has a totally different view on things. And it's a better view than our view. His perspective is better than ours. One of the unique things that we've seen in the book of John is how many times Jesus says something that people don't understand. He often uses words or phrases to represent spiritual truth. But the people almost always take him literally and do not have a clue what he's talking about. Do you remember Nicodemus in chapter 3 when Jesus says, "Nicodemus, you must be born again. You have to be born a second time." And Nicodemus says, "How is that possible? Am I supposed to climb back into my mother's womb?" We look at that and go, "Nick, please. Surely that can't be literal." But that's the response. Chapter 4, it happens again with the woman at the well. Jesus tells this lady in Samaria, "I came to give you living water that will spring up out of you, and you'll never thirst again." And she says, "Sir, give me this water so that I'll never be thirsty and I don't have to keep coming here to draw water." He's talking spiritual, she's thinking literal. Or in chapter 6, especially when Jesus says, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood." And we're told that multitudes and even many of his own followers left him and never came back. Jesus is always talking spiritually from his higher perspective, but people down on the human level are thinking literally and they miss it. Well, this chapter is full of things like that. Things that Jesus says that people don't understand. People in the story and even people like us. This is a story about the resurrection of Lazarus, and we all know it ends well. I think everybody's heard this story, and as we said, Andy just read most of it to us. But it's more than just a story about that event. It's a story that really helps us understand faith. A word that we hear all the time, but this story takes our faith and puts it in the spotlight, puts it under the magnifying glass. And it asks us an incredible question is, do you really believe? We would all nod our heads to that here in the Bible Belt, of course. Yes, we believe. But this chapter says, do you really? Do you believe in something as weird and bizarre as a resurrection? We all would nod our heads again. Of course, we sing these songs every Easter. We're resurrection people. But if somebody comes to you next week and says, I went to a funeral the other day and you will not believe it. The corpse got up out of the casket. We all freaked out. He's alive. If I were you and you're told that, I would report that person to a mental health professional. I do not believe that would happen this week in Gadsden, Alabama. But I glibly nod my head and say, sure, I believe in Jesus' resurrection. I believe in Lazarus' resurrection. No big deal. That's easy. No, that's incredible. That's almost impossible. And John says, you need to really examine this Jesus man to see if you really believe who he is and what he does. Don't just take it for granted. So, do we believe this person is who he is? Remember John's purpose statement in John 20, verse 31, right at the end of the book. He says, I could have written many other things, and we've seen this verse many times, but these things, these stories I'm telling you, these sermons that Jesus gives, I've written them down so that you might believe. You might move toward him so that you know and believe that Jesus is the Christ or the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So that's where this story is going. John is coming to the last one of these 7 signs, the climax. And what a climax it is, raising someone from the dead. And John asks us, do you believe in this man? Do you believe in this kind of miracle? Do we believe this story? And if so, how will we respond? So today's sermon is, I am the resurrection and life. It's the 7th sign, and as we'll see, it's the 5th of 7 I ams. This story lays out in 3 parts, and this is just the skeleton of the story. I'm going to explain what I really want to emphasize in a moment. But in the first 16 verses, Jesus is increasing the faith of the disciples. And then he increases the faith of these 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, in the second half of the book, or chapter 17 to 40. And at the end, he increases the faith, or actually draws a division in the faith between the Jews. Once again, some believe and some get even madder. How is that possible? How do you see a resurrection and get madder and get hateful toward the man that does it? It just keeps happening, doesn't it? Jesus divides where you either come toward him or move away from him. So that's the way the book's laid out. But what I want to focus on for the next few minutes, are 5 lessons that Jesus teaches us in the midst of the story. This chapter is about the resurrection of Lazarus, but it's really about God's ways are not our ways. Jesus is at the top level. He's got the best perspective on anything. We're down here at street level. And so while he's raising Lazarus, he's also going to teach us about genuine faith. He's going to remind us to trust him about top-level things. He has a better perspective than we do. So here we go. In the first 16 verses is where he's building the faith of the disciples. He's going to teach 3 of these 5 lessons to his disciples. And we'll just go quickly through them. But the first one is he has a better view of sickness and suffering than we do, than the disciples do. In verses 1 to 6, as we've already alluded, he describes how Lazarus is sick. The sisters are urgently asking him to come. And we hear that he loves them, but he doesn't come. Why? Because he has a different perspective. Think about our perspective when we get sick or we enter into suffering. What is our perspective? Mine is, please, let's get this over with so I can get back to normal life. I got a fever. I got a headache. I need to get better. Jesus, heal me. ASAP. Get me out of here. Those are my very spiritual ways of responding to sickness and suffering. But Jesus' view from the top level is seen here in these verses where he says 2 very strange things. And he does one very strange thing. The first is, here's what he says. This illness does not lead to death. Now, Andy just read to us about the fact that Lazarus dies. But Jesus says this illness does not lead to death. That's a strange thing to say. Here's the second strange thing he says. This is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, Rudy is up in the hospital, up in Winchester, Tennessee. Most of us know Rudy, one of our dear, dear men here. And if you get up there to see him, I dare you to say, Rudy, this is a good thing. Now, let me tell you, this is not going to lead to death, like we would know that. But secondly, this is for the glory of God and the glory of Jesus, the Son of God, to work through it. So I hope that encourages you, brother. Let me pray with you, and I'm on my way. That's almost what this sounds like. And that sounds rude. If I'm laying in a hospital bed, I'm going to say, why don't you just go on home and let me stay here and worship on my own? But that's Jesus' response. Why? Because he's looking from a top level. We're at the bottom level saying, get it over, please, ASAP. He also does a strange thing that we've already mentioned, this idea of staying 2 extra days. What is going on? Well, his ways are not our ways. But let's explore what he does say here. This illness does not lead to death. Remember, Jesus is looking big picture here, from the top level. He is saying this sickness does not end in death. In other words, it leads through death, but it doesn't lead to death. It doesn't end with death. From the top level, for the believer, for you and me who have come to Jesus, have moved toward him, death is just a doorway, as we see in the story. It's not pleasant to go through, either through sickness or through some tragedy, but it ushers us into a whole new level of life. That is the believer's promise from the top level. This will not end in death. God forbid that Rudy gets worse or any of us face physical death this week or any of our loved ones. But if it does, it's a doorway. It's an instantaneous doorway, by the way. It's sometimes if we see an accident and we see the gruesomeness of that we can't get that picture out of our mind. That's a horrible way to die. And yet, if that person's a believer, they don't even feel the pain of that. It's an instantaneous thing. They black out and they are in the presence of Jesus with a whole new kind of life. This is the promise of the resurrection from the top level. It does not end in death. And Jesus is teaching his disciples, and they're as thinking as literally as we are, what do you mean? He died. But it is through death, not to death. It doesn't end in death. Then this idea that it is for the glory of God and the glory of the Son of God. Glory is one of the main themes in the book of John. In the prologue, in the very earliest verses, we read in verse 14 of chapter 1, the Word, Jesus, who was with God and was God, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten Son. That becomes a theme through this book. When we get to chapter 17, Jesus is right next to the cross, and he's praying, and he says, Father, show your glory. Father, glorify me. And the Father says to him, I have glorified it, and I will glorify your name again. But the glory is going to be through the cross. We think of glory as somebody on a stage with a bunch of people cheering. But the glory of God often comes through the most horrible things. It puts the spotlight on God in a believer's life, even in sickness or in suffering. Sometimes God shows his glory by miraculously healing someone. It happens. Bible church people, sometimes we're so afraid to be called a charismatic that we're afraid to pray for healing. God can show his glory through healing, and he often does. But he also shows his glory through sickness and suffering. Here's something Charles Spurgeon said. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God. The Christian does not merely hold this as a theory, but he knows it as a matter of fact. Everything has worked for good as yet. The poisonous drugs mixed in fit proportions have worked the cure. The sharp cuts of the lancet have cleansed out the proud flesh and facilitated the healing. Every event as yet has worked out to the most divinely blessed results. And so, believing that God rules all, that he governs wisely, that he brings good out of evil, the believer's heart is assured, and he is enabled calmly to meet each trial as it comes. The believer, in the spirit of true resignation, can pray, send me what you will, my God, so long as it comes from you. A bad portion never came from your table to any of your children. That is the perspective of a believer who is exercising faith in the suffering. That, Lord, I am taking What you've given from your table, I want to glorify you through it. Jesus teaches us that he has a better perspective on sickness and suffering. He also has a better perspective for his disciples on mission and safety. Look at verses 7 to 11 here. He says in verse 7, let's go to Judea, which is the area surrounding Jerusalem. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you're going to go there again? This is what just happened in chapter 10. Jesus, this is not safe. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. What is Jesus talking about? He is saying, guys, I've got a mission to do. My hour is coming when it all goes dark, when the light of the world is taken away. But right now is the time to be on mission. And he's reminding them, I am the light of the world, so if you're with me, you are safe. You will not stumble. Now, does that mean that nothing bad will happen to you if you're serving Jesus? Yes and no. It means you're with Jesus, and as Spurgeon just said, you're taking from his table what he gives you. But from the lower perspective, you may go through incredible suffering while you're trying to serve him. And you may, from your lower perspective, cry out at times, this is not fair. But the upper level perspective is, I get glory through my people being on mission even when it's not safe. As Americans, safety can become an idol for us. Now, I'm not encouraging anybody to go jump off the Coosa Bridge this afternoon. We need to be careful and buckle your seatbelt and all that. But the idea here with the disciples is, Jesus, you can't go there. They're mad at you. Don't you remember what happened last week? And Jesus says, I've only got a little time left. Back in 1955, these 5 young men, young husbands, young dads, went on a missions event. They sold everything they had and went to South America, to the beach of Ecuador, and flew in, making friends with the people, the natives on the beach there, so that they could go in and present the gospel. Jim Elliott, Nate Saint, Roger Udarian, all 5 of these guys, incredibly young, bold men for Jesus, had a great plan to invest their lives with this tribe. And we all know the story. The minute their plane touched down, they got out of the plane, they were speared to death. All 5 of them killed instantly. Their wives and children left behind. The world cried out, what a tragedy. From the lower level, this is horrible. How could God let this happen to his servants? The incredible part of the story was a worldwide missions movement came out of this tragedy. God got glory in the most amazing way as people said, I'm signing up. I'll take their place. A couple of the widows went in as single women moved into the tribe. Elizabeth Elliott, Rachel Saint, the sister of Nate Saint. and they spent their lives there. And many people in that tribe came to Jesus. God got glory through the suffering. Jesus is reminding his disciples of the upper view. He also gives a lesson to them about a better view of death and sleep. This is another place where Jesus is talking spiritually and they're thinking literally. Look at verse 11. After saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover." That's a good thing. Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Well, once again, we see that Jesus is saying some strange things. He says, "I'm glad that I wasn't there. I'm glad I didn't go. Jesus, don't you care?" But notice, he's not saying, "I'm glad that he died." He's saying, "I'm glad I waited so that," that's a purpose clause, "so that you may believe." If Lazarus had been healed by Jesus, he could have healed him from 20 miles away like he did on sign number 2, the nobleman's son. He could have just said, "Lazarus, be healed." And that would have increased the faith of these guys a little more. But when Lazarus falls asleep, when he dies, the faith of these guys and the sisters and some of the Jews is going to skyrocket. Jesus knows what he's doing. He's not uncaring, but he has an upper level view. It's called the will of God, the sovereign will of God. And he is glorified through this more than they could ever imagine. It's for the glory of God and the glory of the Son. We see quickly another perspective where he teaches the sisters, Mary and Martha. And in verses 17 to 44, we see this better view of the resurrection and life. And I'm going to close with this one for today, and we'll come back to it next week. But as you go into verses 17 to 44, you see that Jesus is talking to them in such a way that makes their faith increase incredibly. Martha and Mary have unique personalities that we read about in the book of Luke, where Jesus is staying with them, and you probably remember the story where Martha, apparently the older sister and the responsible one, is fervently working in the kitchen and serving, and she gets upset because Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus. And Martha comes out and says, "Jesus, make my sister help me." And Jesus says, "Martha, Mary has chosen the better thing." Now, I won't go into all that today because God gave them both those personalities, but you see it in this story too. Martha is the first one to go out and greet Jesus when he finally gets there. And Martha says to him in verse 21, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Is that Martha being angry again? Maybe there is some frustration there. Where have you been? But it's also a statement of incredible faith. Lord, you could have kept him from dying. I go see people in the hospital as a pastor, and I've never had someone say that to me at a funeral later. Tim, if you had been here the other day, you could have kept them from dying. I don't have that power. Martha is recognizing, Jesus, you've got the power. I really believe this. And then she goes on and says, but even now in verse 22, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. I know God's going to work this out. And Martha has incredible faith here. Jesus asks her, tells her, in verse 23, Martha, your brother will rise again. And Martha shows her incredible faith here when she says, I know he will rise again at the last day. She is saying, I believe the truth that you've taught, that you will be the judge at the resurrection and that the righteous will rise. That's an incredible statement of faith. She could have said, I want him here now. I want him well. Where were you? She says, I really believe that. And Jesus says to her in verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. This is the fifth time he says, I am. I am the same as the name given to Moses at the bush. The great I am. I am. The resurrection is not just an event, it's a person. It's me. Martha, do you believe this? That is the big question. That is the big question for all of us, as we said at the beginning. We nod our heads to this, but do you really believe this? My father-in-law, Becky's dad, Ed Teal, was a pastor. And I was preaching at our church in Texas. It was one of those times our pastor was out of town, and as the youth pastor, I finally got the chance to preach. And I was preaching on John 11. I was reading this story, and the phone rang in my office. And Becky's former pastor, Pastor Pyle, called me. And I said, hey, Pastor Pyle, he helped participate in our wedding. I said, Pastor Pyle, it's great to hear from you. What's up? And he said, Tim, I'm afraid I got some bad news. I said, what do you mean? He said, it's about Ed, Becky's dad. He just dropped dead this morning, 59 years old. Good health, walking around the block. This is the last thing he did. He walked in the door, said, Doris, I'm home, and she heard a thump, and he hit the floor, and he was gone. I was in shock, and then I thought, I've got to go tell Becky. After I talked to him a few minutes, I put my hand on my head, and I looked down at John 11. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will never die. It will never end in death. And he who believes in me, even if he dies, he will live forever. Do you believe this? I began to weep as I was reading, and my tears fell on this very passage. And it struck me, I've believed this in my head all this time. Do I believe it right now when I'm going to the funeral? This is the question. Do you really believe this man? Do you believe him enough to follow him? Do you believe him enough to yield your life to him? Do you believe him enough to worship him and say, I will do anything you say? You are the real life. That's the point of the story. We'll continue it next week. Let's pray. Father, as we've gone through this book and we keep seeing these pictures of Jesus We sing about him all the time. We know these stories, but help us to love him more. Help us to worship him. If there's anyone among us who have not yielded their life to him, I pray that they might do it in their own heart. But those of us who know him, who know these things, help us to really move forward in our faith, to trust him more, to yield to him more, to give him glory. We thank you that this life is not all there is. He is the resurrection and the real life that leads to eternal life. We thank you in your name.